I love football. I grew up on football. My childhood was running around in the neighborhood and catching balls over my shoulder. We just need to recognize that this head issue is a real issue.
I think that football's watched much differently than it was 10 years ago. It's taken a lot of air out of the game.
In September of 2009, I did the first couple of stories for the New York Times on chronic traumatic encephalopathy in NFL players. And the Times said, we want you to cover this story wherever it goes. We didn't see it as an NFL story. We saw it as a public health story.
No one can say that they didn't think this was a dangerous sport. And you're playing with probably the biggest humans on earth, and you go lead with your head, so you are going to have some head trauma.
It's an incredibly crucial time for the sport. There's certainly much more of an awareness around athlete health.
Football is a uniquely American tradition, but thousands of student athletes are injured every year. Many of those injuries are concussions.
It happened gradually, but it also happened suddenly when people said to themselves, ooh, do I want my kid playing this game? And so things became personal.
If you were to track the number of publications focused on CTE in the last 3 years, it's an exponential increase.
Repetitive head trauma chokes the brain.
Movie concussion was important as an industry on the whole to really ensure that there's innovation being injected into this industry.
Repetitive concussive injuries is really the one thing that separates CTE from any other kind of head trauma. Research shows it's just the repetitive milder concussions that seem to have the most effect, neurologically. It's just the repetitiveness, not allowing the brain to heal.
From a helmet manufacturer or an equipment manufacturer standpoint, innovation has accelerated probably as a result of public attention to head injuries and player health and safety.
Helmets do protect the head, and I'm sure to some extent they decrease the number of concussions, and for that matter, subconcussive hits. The question is, what do we need to know to do a better job?
I think our responsibility is to do sound research and make really good design decisions and fully test our products and put state-of-the-art protective gear on the field.
On this play, Young is hurt and is led off the field.
The reason that helmet standards were put in place in the late 60s and early 70s was to address the alarming number of skull fractures that were taking place. And they've done a fantastic job at that. But there was a cost. The brain is like a yolk inside an eggshell. The helmet and the padding within the helmet is so firm, it will allow more force to push the head. The yoke is going to keep traveling and bang against the inside of the eggshell. And so you're faced with this trade-off of either protecting the shell of the head or the yoke of the head.
Viking quarterback Joe Cap carries for 2 yards.
Generally speaking, the same helmets were used for decades. But now, once they've realized that this is a really big deal, they had to change their helmets quite quickly to adapt to the environment.
It's easy to hope that somebody can ride to the rescue with a silver bullet. It's more complex than F equals MA. Your brain is a very complicated organ.
It's the deceleration of the head ultimately, or the ability to decelerate an opponent, for example, that's actually quite crucial.
A lot has been done to study different dynamics of motion that may cause strain on brain tissue.
So we're not only looking at let's say, more superficial outcomes like head acceleration, but what's actually happening at the level of the cell of the brain.
There's long been a crossover between injury research in the automotive industry and the sports world. A lot of it started to come together, I think, in the mid and late 1960s when some of the injury metrics started being used to evaluate protective sports helmets.
If you look at helmet history and development, the plastic shell was really kind of your seatbelt. It provided a very specific function, but what was missing was the airbag. It's moving incredibly fast. The idea of kind of cobbling together various foams and plastics to find the optimal solution is somewhat antiquated. It's possible to engineer a product that performs well on standardized tests, but is that the best product for the athlete on the field during the game? So these are questions that we genuinely challenge ourselves with right now because sometimes they're actually at odds. We have engineers, test technicians focusing on drop testing, as well as pneumatic ram testing specifically, to really identify opportunities for innovation. We have a full simulation team now that's dedicated to running simulations full-time and optimizing studies in the digital world, which allows us to move much more quickly.
There's a number of different injury indices. That's the sort of data that we can hand off to our designers and our engineers that can then develop particular features or techniques within the helmet to better reduce those forces.
There's the high energy side of the spectrum, which is head to ground, some very serious head-to-head impacts. On the other end of the spectrum are the hundreds, if not thousands, of low-level energy impacts that are seen throughout a season. The technology that we put into the helmet needs to be great across this spectrum of impact energies. I would say the challenge comes right now with some of the unknowns. It's understanding the fundamental science behind concussion mechanism, which we don't currently have. It's understanding the relationship between these low-level impacts, frequency of impact, and CTE down the road.
A linear hit is when you get a force from the side that will push your head in a line. A rotational hit is when you get hit on the side and your head rotates. It's very difficult to handle rotational forces.
The science was leading us to a point where we recognized that rotational acceleration of the head and the brain was a significant contributor to athlete head health. That directly fueled, I would say, a few innovations. First and foremost, functionally decoupling the shell from what we call the inner shock matrix. So allowing that shell to kind of operate independently from the head. So you can imagine that when the shell is hit, it allows for kind of independent motion of the shell and the head. So the more time you can give for that impact to be absorbed, the lower the impulse will be as well for that impact. Second of which, this is not a traditional foam kind of solid state material. It's actually an open cell air bladder. When it's hit hard or at a high speed, that air is trying to escape altogether. So it actually stiffens the system and allows it to mitigate or absorb energy across a range of impact energies. So those big head to ground hits, as well as those lower level kind of hundreds and thousands of hits that happen throughout the season.
Go!
A lot of the public's attention is on the National Football League and the elite colleges. But most of the football players play in high school and junior high and youth leagues by a factor of 100.
It's been in the last few years where we've really seen a lot of scientific efforts put behind the youth level, understanding impact forces, frequency of impact, how do we best account for brain development. There are several unknowns, I would say, especially as you go down to that youth level, about the particular elements of protection that they need.
This is a conversation that needs to be had in our society. I would never tell a parent not to be concerned about the implications of having your child bang their head against anything hundreds of times in the course of a season. I mean, where else in society do we say that's okay? Nowhere.
Any kind of trauma in your younger lives is never good. It's just a compounding effect. The longer you have these kinds of traumas, the worse it is.
if you're going to play football, you might as well have the very best equipment available.
I think helmets are going to get more personalized. Riddell has a technology called Precision Fit. It's the process of scanning the surface of a player's head and using that scan to create a unique helmet liner set that matches the surface of that player's head. Imagine a parent or a football coach being able to use a phone app to scan the surface of their players' heads and then have custom or best fit helmets supplied for their team based on scans of their head.
We're at a stage in our technology that we should be able to develop sensors that can go into a helmet. And whether the individual decides, I don't have a head injury, they don't know that. They can't feel it. But the sensor could feel the force.
Data, sabermetrics are being used in all sports. And there's no reason that shouldn't extend to player safety as well. We've developed a technology called Insight. That has been a tool that High School USA can use to help monitor their players. Now, more recently, we've taken that data and developed a technology called Insight Training Tool, which is the smart technology that I view as the future of football.
We're giving the users at that school the ability to monitor every impact a player takes in real time.
There'll be a time 5 years from now maybe that it'll be difficult to purchase a helmet that doesn't have some sort of impact sensor array in it.
Your starting middle linebacker has more impacts on the top of his head this week than a high school linebacker typically has.
This is the sort of tool that can enlighten them and possibly help them change their coaching behavior to change their players' behavior.
There's a time and a place for everything. I would argue that the best thing they can do is encourage flag football at the youngest ages, so more kids touch the game. And once they're playing the game, what are kids going to want? They're going to want to transition into tackle football.
If the science points us towards the fact that, kids should not start playing tackle football until 14, we're happy to go in that direction and make sure that we're developing product that addresses the non-tackle flag football market.
I don't think that this is inherently a losing battle or that we'll never catch up. I think the goal is to decrease the dangers inherent in the sport and then increase the amount that we know about ameliorating those dangers and closing that gap as best we can.
I think there will always be an inherent risk in the game. There's going to be kind of a co-evolution of product and the sport as a whole, which I don't think there's a logical endpoint, at which point we feel like, oh, we're safe enough, let's go work on something else.
I don't think you're ever going to say, we're done, we don't need to do anything more. I think there's always going to be a need to improve the safety of the game.
We know a fairly sure strategy would be to wrap an athlete in bubble wrap and have them go run around and bounce off of each other, but that takes away what we love and what's exciting about the sport.